Nobody in that banquet hall knew the man in the plain dress shirt standing near the back wall had once held 3 world championship belts. Derek Voss saw only Evan Rourke, a quiet single father who had refused to give up his seat in front of billionaire Celeste Harrington. Derek grabbed the microphone, called Evan a coward, and challenged him onto the exhibition ring set up in the center of the room. Evan stayed silent until an older guest spotted the scar above his eyebrow, recognized the stance, and dropped his wine glass. That's Rourke. If you believe real strength lives in restraint, stay with this story until the very last word. The Harrington Crown Foundation had chosen one of Philadelphia's most prestigious hotels for its annual gala, filling the grand ballroom with investment partners, city officials, and philanthropists who had spent the week rehearsing their concern for the community. The evening's centerpiece was an announcement that had been quietly anticipated for months: a $40 million commitment to expand Riverside Renewal Center, a facility that served veterans navigating re-entry, workers displaced by industrial shifts, patients rebuilding strength after injury, and anyone who needed a structured place to begin again. The center's director, a man named Frank Abernathy, was 2 days out of hip surgery and could not attend, so the foundation had asked whoever could reach the hotel by 7 to represent Riverside in his place. That person turned out to be Evan Rourke, the facility manager, who arrived in a white dress shirt with no tie, found a seat in the back row near the catering exit, and had not spoken to a single other guest by the time the first course was cleared. His phone buzzed once during the opening remarks. It was Tessa, his 16-year-old daughter, reminding him not to stay late because they had an agreement about Saturday morning breakfast, the kind of agreement that did not bend for foundation galas or $40 million announcements. He typed back 2 words and put the phone face down on his knee, watching the stage with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that most rooms rewarded the loudest voice and punished the most accurate one. Celeste Harrington took the podium in a charcoal blazer, speaking without notes, and Evan watched the way she paused before the difficult numbers, as if she had already accepted the weight of them. She was not performing for the room. She was calculating inside it, which was a distinction most people in the hall did not notice. The trouble arrived in the form of Derek Voss, who owned a fitness brand called Voss Apex and had built a following large enough to fill stadium tours on the back of an image that was part athletic inspiration, part lifestyle entertainment, and entirely manufactured. Derek was 36, broad-shouldered, and wore a suit that had been tailored to make both of those facts immediately apparent. He had arrived at the gala with a film crew under the guise of documenting his philanthropic interests, and within the first 20 minutes he had already made a joke at the expense of a server, handed his jacket to another as if she were a coat rack, and found a reason to stand beside Celeste Harrington while the cameras rolled. Preston Blackwell, Harrington Dominion's chief financial officer, moved quietly beside Derek throughout the evening, the kind of proximity that was easy to miss unless you were looking for it. And Preston had prepared a set of financial reports that presented Riverside as a poorly managed facility bleeding money it had not actually spent, timed to coincide with the evening's final vote. When Celeste paused the announcement to review the documents Preston had flagged, Derek stepped forward and proposed a pivot: redirect the full $40 million to Voss Apex, which would build something modern, efficient, and nationally recognized. The proposal was dressed in language about innovation and community access, but what Derek had not said aloud, what Preston already knew, was that Voss Apex had no intention of operating a public facility. They needed Celeste to declare Riverside a failure so they could move the land through a holding company before anyone noticed a new transit line was about to make that particular block worth more than $100 million. During the networking portion of the evening, Derek moved through the room, identifying people who would serve his needs and dismissing those who would not. And when he reached the back row and found a seat occupied by a man in a plain shirt with no name badge and no phone out for photographs, he assumed the man had wandered in from a service entrance. He asked Evan to move. Evan said the seat had been assigned to Riverside's representative. Derek smiled the way men smile when they have decided to be patient for exactly as long as it takes to make a point. And then he asked again, louder, with the microphone someone had handed him still warm from the last speaker. He called Evan the quietest man in the room, then the most forgettable, and finally the kind of man who showed up to represent a failing organization because nobody with a real stake in the outcome bothered to come. The exhibition ring, a padded platform assembled for a light sparring demonstration earlier in the evening, was still set up at the far end of the hall, and Derek gestured toward it and invited Evan to prove, in 60 seconds, that the people at Riverside were worth the foundation's money. The room went uncomfortably quiet for a moment before Derek's crew started the laughter, and then the laughter spread, and Evan Rourke sat there with his hands on his knees and said nothing at all. Evan declined once, clearly and without heat, explaining that he had come to answer questions about the center's programs and outcomes, not to perform for an audience that had already been primed to enjoy the spectacle. Derek used the microphone to reframe the refusal as confirmation. If the man representing Riverside would not step up to a simple 60-second exhibition, then perhaps Riverside's culture of retreat was the real problem, not the financial reports. He walked the framing across the room in a slow circle, letting it settle into every conversation that was already half-formed, every hesitation Celeste Harrington was already feeling about the inconsistencies Preston had placed in front of her. Celeste asked Derek to step back from the platform, her voice controlled and direct, but Derek pivoted immediately and offered to donate $100,000 to Riverside on the spot if Evan could simply remain standing for 60 seconds on the exhibition floor. The room's attention crystallized around the offer the way it always does when money appears as a performance prop, and Evan sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for 3 seconds before he looked up. He agreed to the exhibition on 4 conditions. Derek would sign a written confirmation of the donation before either of them approached the ring. The sparring gloves used would be the largest size available in the event kit. There would be no strikes to the back of the head, and the moment a designated safety official called a stop, both men would step back immediately. Derek agreed with the ease of someone who expected none of the conditions to matter, signed the paper a foundation staffer printed from a laptop in the coat room, and pulled on his gloves while his camera operator found the best angle. On the exhibition floor, Evan kept his hands lower than any trained fighter would, his elbows slightly out, his weight settled, as if he had been standing exactly there for years and simply decided not to move. Derek threw first, a jab that was faster than most of the guests expected and harder than the exhibition context called for, and it passed through the space where Evan's head had been a quarter second earlier because Evan had turned his chin exactly 3 inches to the left without shifting his feet. The next combination came faster and harder, Derek's footwork pushing forward the way it does when a man is accustomed to smaller people backing up, and Evan redirected every part of it with movements so economical they barely looked like defense. He stepped half a pace back on the 4th exchange, rolled his shoulder on the 5th, and made Derek's 6th combination disappear by simply no longer occupying the geometry it had been aimed at. Derek's breathing changed at around the 40-second mark, the cadence shifting from controlled aggression to something rougher, and he loaded a right hand that carried genuine force behind it. He swung. Evan turned, placed one hand lightly on Derek's extending shoulder, and redirected the momentum downward with the patient precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times in rooms with no audience at all. Derek's front knee touched the padded floor. He was not hurt. He was simply no longer standing, and the distinction did not make it easier. The room went completely still in a way that had nothing to do with the music pausing. Evan removed his gloves without ceremony and set them on the corner post, already moving toward the back of the room. He did not raise his hands, did not look at Derek's camera, and his expression carried nothing that resembled satisfaction. Malcolm Dyer, a retired sportscaster who had spent 30 years covering championship boxing from ringside in venues on 4 continents, was standing near the bar with a glass of red wine, and he was staring at the scar above Evan's left eyebrow, a small, faded crescent that sat in the exact position where a world-ranked heavyweight contender had opened a cut in the 7th round of a title defense 12 years ago. Malcolm set down his glass too quickly. He said the name the way you say a name when you are not sure the person in front of you is real. He said, that was Evan Rourke. He said it again because no one had heard the first time, and then the room understood that Derek Voss had chosen his exhibition partner from the wrong end of the guest list. Derek stood up slowly, and in the moment before his expression closed, something moved across his face that looked very much like the recognition of a man who had just remembered something useful, something about a scandal, and a missing champion, and a story that had never been properly finished. The footage spread before midnight, and by morning it had reached the people who had spent 12 years following the cold trails of a career that had ended without a press conference or a farewell fight. The archive pulled itself up in pieces, the weigh-ins, the title defenses, the slow-motion studies of a defensive style so refined that coaches in other countries had used the tapes as teaching material. Evan Rourke had competed as a light heavyweight, had held 3 major sanctioning body belts simultaneously at his peak, and had never been knocked down in a professional contest. His record was not merely good. It was the kind of record that made people argue about where he belonged in all-time rankings, which is the boxing equivalent of being named to something permanent. 12 years before the gala, Evan had been in Detroit defending his last belt when Nora Rourke died in a highway accident outside Philadelphia on a Thursday afternoon in November. He had been a 3-hour flight away, in a locker room that smelled like liniment and adrenaline, winning a fight he no longer remembered the score of, and he had been unreachable for 4 hours while the people who loved Nora tried to find him. He flew home the same night, and the version of him that boarded that plane was not the same as the version that had ever trained or competed or cared about a championship. He sold most of what he owned, declined every interview, and removed himself from the sport with such thoroughness that the only public record of his departure was a 2-sentence statement his manager released on a Tuesday morning. He had been raising Tessa in a row house in South Philadelphia for 12 years, working maintenance jobs that kept him moving and kept him useful, and he had not spoken to a reporter about boxing in all that time. There had also been a rumor, years old and never confirmed, about irregular betting activity in the final title defense, a pattern of late money that suggested someone with advanced knowledge of the outcome. The Athletic Commission had investigated and found no direct evidence linking Evan to the wagering, but the file had never been formally closed, and the rumor had never been answered because Evan had never addressed it. He had simply disappeared, which many people read as guilt, and which was, in fact, something else entirely. Celeste found Evan at the hotel the next morning before he left, and she asked him plainly why a man who could have spent the last decade living on endorsements and appearances had chosen to manage the maintenance schedule of a non-profit facility instead. Evan told her that the endorsements would have bought him a larger house and a smaller life, and that he had already lived through the version of himself that considered a missed birthday acceptable. because the training camp was going well. He said it without self-pity and without the performance of humility that people put on when they want credit for sacrifice. He said it like a fact about geography. Derek had already moved. By mid-morning, he had released a version of the exhibition footage that compressed the full sequence into 40 seconds and removed the portion showing him load the right hand that Evan had redirected to the floor, so that in the edited version, Evan appeared to advance aggressively and Derek appeared to stumble backward from a shove. Derek announced publicly that he was withdrawing his charitable pledge and considering legal action against Riverside for permitting an active combat sports professional to physically engage an unsuspecting guest at a foundation event. Preston used the window immediately, circulating the video among Harrington Dominion's board with a note about liability and the inadvisability of maintaining the $40 million commitment while the situation was under review. Celeste did not believe the edited footage, but she could not ignore a board that was watching it, and so the announcement was suspended. Term. Celeste drove to Riverside alone 3 days after the gala, without telling Preston or Lena where she was going, because she had decided the only data she trusted was the kind she collected herself. She had expected a facility that matched Preston's reports. Aging equipment, minimal participation, staff stretched thin across programs that served too few people to justify the operating cost. What she found was a building that smelled like fresh floor wax and chlorine, a weight room where every machine had a current calibration tag, and a hallway where a scheduling board showed 3 morning programs running simultaneously, including a balance class for veterans and an occupational therapy circuit where a woman in her 50s worked with the focused attention of someone who had been shown exactly why each movement mattered. Evan was in the mechanical room at the back of the building, replacing a bearing in one of the resistance training units with the patience of someone who preferred working problems to performing expertise. He did not come out to greet Celeste when the front desk called back to let him know she was there. He finished the repair, washed his hands, and walked to where she was standing in the hallway because that was the order in which things needed to happen. An older veteran named Theodore was waiting near the rehabilitation bay entrance for help with a footwork sequence that was part of his recovery protocol, and Evan stopped to work through it with him before reaching Celeste, spending 4 minutes on an adjustment that improved Theodore's balance by enough that the man laughed out loud when he felt the difference. Celeste watched all of it, and she was good at watching people who did not know they were being evaluated. What she observed in Evan Rourke was a quality she had spent 2 decades trying to build in her executive teams without success. It was not competence. She had rooms full of competent people. It was the specific kind of authority that comes from someone who has no interest in whether you notice them. Lena Whitcomb had been working a parallel track, reviewing Riverside's actual financial records against the versions Preston had submitted to the board, and the maintenance cost discrepancies were not accounting errors. 3 separate line items, HVAC servicing, roof repair, and electrical infrastructure, had been inflated by amounts that, taken together, added up to more than $200,000 in false expenditure, and the purpose was not to steal the money, but to make the facility's operating ratio look unsustainable. Separately, Lena had flagged a property development file showing a transportation infrastructure project had been approved 6 months earlier, routing a new transit corridor within 4 blocks of Riverside's location, and the effect on the land's assessed value was not subtle. A parcel appraised at $18 million would be worth somewhere north of $100 million within 36 months. A company called Northstar Leisure had submitted a quiet letter of interest to acquire the Riverside property contingent on Harrington Foundation declaring the center non-operational and the ownership structure of Northstar was layered through 3 holding entities in 2 states. But the registered agent address on the innermost entity matched a commercial mail service used by Voss Apex Fitness for its licensing operations. Evan understood the architecture of it clearly when Celeste explained what Lena had found, because the architecture was simple. Derek had never wanted the $40 million redirected to his fitness brand. He had wanted the land, and he had needed someone inside the foundation to make Riverside look like a liability before the transit announcement became public knowledge. Celeste asked Evan to help her document the scheme formally, and Evan told her he would not be used as a brand asset or a media counterweight, that he was not interested in being the foundation's story of redemption any more than he was interested in being Derek's punching bag. She said she understood that, and then she said something different. She told him that Nora's name was in Preston's original financial file, attached to a $2 million transaction that had been characterized as a pre-fight payment, and that if Evan did not help correct the record, that characterization would stand. The document that appeared overnight on a financial newswire did not name a source and did not provide complete context, but it named Nora Rourke and a $2 million wire transfer that had cleared 4 days before Evan's final title defense, and the implication in the headline was unmistakable. Tessa did not shield her father from what people were saying. She told him in the flat, careful tone of someone delivering a diagnosis. And the general consensus among those who had always assumed his disappearance was the retreat of a guilty man, was that the paper finally confirmed what they had believed. Evan told the director of Riverside that morning that he was prepared to resign his position so the center could distance itself from the attention, and he said it in the same tone he used when reporting a broken water line. Factual, no editorializing, ready to act on the practical solution. The director, speaking from a hospital bed on a video call, told him that the only thing that would actually help Riverside was the truth, and that the person best positioned to provide it was the one who knew it. Tessa arrived at the facility that afternoon with a cardboard box sealed with packing tape, labeled on top in Nora's handwriting, "For Evan, when it matters." She had found it in a storage unit 2 years earlier and had held onto it until she understood what it was for. She set it on the table in Evan's office without ceremony and told him she did not need a father who disappeared in order to protect her. She needed one who was willing to stand in the right place and say the right thing even when it was difficult, and then she left before he could respond. The box contained 12 items: bank correspondence, an insurance settlement agreement, a series of printed emails, and a small external hard drive. The $2 million had been an insurance payout, not a payment. Nora had a life and disability policy through the sports management agency that handled Evan's contracts, and the agency had processed a beneficiary disbursement through its financial clearinghouse 4 days before the fight, a timing coincidence created by the agency's fiscal quarter close, not by anything connected to the outcome. The financial clearinghouse that had processed the transaction was a company called Meridian Sports Holdings. The compliance officer at Meridian Sports Holdings at the time of the transaction had been Preston Blackwell, 4 years before he joined Harrington Dominion. Nora had suspected it. Her annotations on the printed emails showed her tracking the discrepancy between how the transaction had been described internally and how it appeared in the public filing, and she had written in the margin of the final document, in her careful left-leaning handwriting. He changed the language. Find who authorized it. Gideon Cross confirmed the rest when Evan called him that evening. The betting pattern in Evan's final title defense had originated from 4 accounts, and Gideon had kept the commission's supplementary investigation file, the one that had not been published, which showed all 4 accounts traced to a single registered investment vehicle whose managing partner had been Preston Blackwell. Lena, working from the North Star Leisure records simultaneously, found that the holding structure Derek and Preston were using now was architecturally identical to the one Preston had used 12 years before. The same layering method, the same jurisdictions, the same approach to burying the beneficial ownership. Derek announced a 3-round exhibition rematch the following week, attaching a $5 million pledge to Riverside contingent on the result. Knowing the pledge would create pressure and the framing would create audience, Celeste reviewed the event contract language with Lena and found a clause requiring full financial disclosure and independent audit of all pledged funds as a condition of the sanctioning body's approval. Evan read the contract 3 times and understood what it meant. Derek had written a trap and accidentally built a door. Evan accepted the bout on conditions he named himself. Full oversight from the State Athletic Commission, a referee with no financial relationship to either party, no bonus for a stoppage finish, and a requirement that all pledged charitable funds pass through an independent audit before disbursement. Derek's team agreed to all 4 without reading them carefully, which told Evan everything he needed to know about how seriously they were taking the preparation. Derek had looked at a 43-year-old maintenance worker who had been out of professional competition for 12 years and calculated a probability of embarrassment, and he was not wrong about the arithmetic. He was wrong about what the arithmetic meant. Evan went back to Gideon's gym in North Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning, the first time he had trained seriously in that building in over a decade. He did not go there to become the man he had been at 31, because that man no longer existed and the attempt to revive him would have been a waste of 2 weeks. He went there to identify what remained, what the body still knew, what the mind could still access, what the years of physical facility management had preserved in terms of conditioning, and then to build a strategy around the actual version of himself that would be standing in the ring. Gideon watched the first session from a folding chair without saying anything for 40 minutes, which was the most informative kind of coaching, and what he saw was not a diminished fighter but a refined one. The speed had changed, the angles had not, and the particular quality of stillness that had always made Evan difficult to hit had been deepened rather than eroded by the years away from competition. Evan worked on breathing economy, on the lateral footwork that created angles without requiring the lateral speed he was no longer certain he possessed in full, and on a specific bodywork pattern targeted at the left side of Derek's torso, not designed to drop him but designed to inform him, over 9 minutes, that the area was going to become a problem. He did not train to knock Derek Voss out. He trained to be undeniable. The evenings were different. Celeste and Lena were working the North Star investigation after business hours, pulling in corporation records and cross-referencing them against Harrington Dominion's internal transaction logs, and Evan would sometimes sit across the conference table from Celeste while she reviewed documents. She told him one night that her father had believed a leader who showed uncertainty was a leader who invited challenges, and that this belief had made her spend the first decade of her tenure at Harrington keeping every difficult decision inside a compartment no one else was allowed to see. Evan said the thing he had come to understand, that strength was not the concealment of vulnerability, but the judgment to know who had earned the right to see it. And he said it without making it about her, and she heard it as being about herself anyway, which was the most useful kind of conversation. Lena discovered the mechanism of Preston's planned move on a Thursday evening. A special board session had been quietly scheduled for the same night as the exhibition rematch, framed as an emergency governance review triggered by the financial liability questions. If the session reached quorum and the prepared resolution passed, Celeste could be removed from operational authority over the Riverside transaction before the audit results were published, giving Preston a 6 to 12-hour window in which the North Star purchase agreement could be executed before the Commission's findings stopped it. And the plan depended entirely on one thing: that Celeste would be at the exhibition venue when the vote convened, 1,000 feet away and legally outside the room. Derek sent a message to Evan's phone the night before the bout with an attached audio file, and he said the recording was Nora's final voice message and that he would play it for every person in the venue before the opening bell unless Evan withdrew. He described it as proof that even the person who loved Evan most had known he was wrong to keep fighting. Evan sat with the phone in his hand long enough that the room got dark around him and he had not turned on a light. He did not call Celeste, and he did not call Gideon. He got up and went to the box, and he took out the hard drive, and he listened to the original recording the way you listen to something you have been carrying at a distance for 12 years and are finally ready to hold close. Nora's voice was not broken in the recording. It was measured in the particular way that people who have accepted a hard thing speak, not resigned, not defeated, but clear. She did not say she needed him to walk away from boxing. She said she needed him to come home. She said she needed him to understand that the man she had fallen in love with was not the man on the promotional posters, and that the belt had never been the thing that made him worth loving. She said she wanted Tessa to know her father the same way Nora knew him. Not by his record, but by the way he showed up. Evan understood that night that the silence he had been keeping for 12 years had started as grief and had slowly become punishment. He had stepped back from the sport because he blamed himself for being 3 hours away, and he had stayed back because stepping forward meant confronting the story that had been written about him in his absence. A story Preston had authored that Derek was now trying to weaponize, and that Evan had given 12 years of silence to validate. Nora had not asked him to disappear. She had asked him to return, and the distance between those two instructions was the full length of the last decade. He called Celeste and told her he was not withdrawing, and she asked if he was certain, and he said the most honest thing he had said in a long time. He said he was going into the ring not to win something back, but to refuse to let the wrong story about Nora be the final version. Lena prepared an injunctive filing, timed to be executable the moment the board session was called to order. Malcolm Dyer agreed to release the full, unedited gala footage through his sports journalism archive, with timestamps showing Derek approaching first and the sequence of events in their actual order. Gideon arrived at the venue 2 hours before the doors opened and conducted a full review of the equipment, the gloves, the hand wraps, the ring canvas, and the identity of every member of the medical team, with the systematic attention of a man who had learned that the details you check before a fight are the only details you control during one. Before the bout, Derek was given access to a microphone for introductions, and he played a version of the recording, 42 seconds, cut from the middle, starting after the sentence about coming home and ending before the sentence about what made Evan worth loving. And in the edited version, Nora sounded like a woman at the end of her patience with a husband who chose competition over family. The audience heard it and went quiet with the specific discomfort of people who have been given intimate information they did not ask for. Evan walked to the ring in a plain gray robe with no sponsor text and no embroidery, his hands wrapped in white, and he climbed through the ropes without theatrics, and stood in his corner looking at the middle distance while Derek worked the crowd on the opposite side. Derek leaned across the center of the ring before the referee's instructions and said he had chosen Evan at the gala because quiet men never fought back. Evan looked at him the way a man looks at something he has already finished calculating and said, "You mistook restraint for fear." The referee called them back to their corners. Preston Blackwell, in the Harrington Dominion building 14 blocks away, called the special board session to order and asked the secretary to begin recording attendance. The timekeeper raised the clapper, and the bell rang. Derek came out of his corner for the first round, moving fast, which was the correct tactical choice, given the age differential, and the question of whether Evan still had the conditioning to absorb pressure across 3 rounds. He threw 23 punches in the opening 2 minutes, none of which landed cleanly, which was not apparent to most of the audience. Because the movement required to avoid 23 punches does not look dramatic from the outside. Evan moved constantly, but without urgency, changing his relationship to Derek's center line with incremental adjustments that were each individually too small to identify, but collectively prevented Derek from establishing the range he needed. And by the end of the first round, the audience had recognized that something unusual was happening, which was that the older, supposedly slower man had not been hit. Derek's corner made the adjustment between rounds. Slow down, control distance. Do not throw in combination until you have established what is happening with his footwork. Derek heard the advice and went out for the second round with the intention of following it for approximately 45 seconds, at which point his competitive instinct reasserted itself, and he began loading single punches with escalating force, searching for the one that would make everything visible. He caught Evan on the shoulder with a right hand that had genuine weight behind it, and Evan rolled with the contact and let the force pass through him rather than resist it, the way a well-built structure absorbs lateral pressure by distributing rather than opposing. Late in the second round, Derek threw a punch after the referee had called a break and was warned. He did not look embarrassed. He looked like a man who had decided the rules were a variable he could manage. Evan's work in the second was quiet and accumulated. He used his right hand to the body 4 times in ways that were legal, precise, and cumulative, not designed to drop Derek but designed to inform him that the ribs on his left side were going to become a problem in the third. Simultaneously, 14 blocks away, Lena walked into the Harrington Dominion boardroom with a printed injunctive order and placed it in front of the session chair before Preston had finished his presentation. She did not raise her voice. She placed the document and stood beside it. Derek came forward in the third round with the energy of a man trying to outrun a conclusion he could see forming. He found an angle near the ropes and threw a right hand at Evan's jaw with everything he had left. Evan moved his head 3 inches, let the punch miss wide, and in the space created by Derek's overextension, set his feet and threw a single counter to the left side of Derek's body, the exact area he had been conditioning since the second round. With precise, unhurried force, Derek did not fall from the punch. He bent, and then he went down, his knee touching the canvas in the involuntary way the body responds when something important in the core has been switched off by impact. He tried to stand at the count of 5. He tried again at 7. The referee completed the count. Evan walked to Derek's corner and put his hand on the stool post and looked at Derek directly, making sure the man was breathing correctly and that the damage was limited to what had been intended, and Derek looked back at him with an expression that had lost every layer of performance it had carried into the building. Malcolm released the full footage archive. The complete recording from Nora's hard drive followed it within the hour, accompanied by a written chronology Lena had prepared showing the actual sequence of the insurance transaction and Preston's role in mischaracterizing it. The image of a bully choosing a quiet man and being quietly dismantled, set beside the true words of the woman whose memory he had tried to weaponize, moved through the public the way corrections rarely move and verdicts sometimes do. Celeste, watching from the venue floor, received a message from Lena's paralegal that said, "Preston is running." Celeste left the venue without waiting for the post-bout formalities and was in the Harrington Dominion elevator before the ring announcer finished the official decision. The boardroom was in partial disorder when she arrived. 3 members on their phones, 2 reviewing documents, 1 standing at the window. And Preston was at the head of the table attempting to complete a motion that would authorize the North Star transaction under an emergency provision he had drafted and circulated that morning. The injunction Lena had served made the motion unenforceable, a fact Preston had apparently decided to test by proceedings anyway. And Celeste walked to the head of the table, picked up the motion document, and read the entire thing standing up without sitting down or saying a word, which was the kind of silence that reorganizes a room. Lena had prepared a complete financial disclosure package. Preston's original manipulation of Riverside's cost reports, the North Star Leisure ownership, traced through 2 shell layers to a limited liability company whose registered manager was Derek Voss, and the parallel structure comparison showing the current scheme used the same jurisdictional architecture as the Meridian Sports Holdings arrangement from 12 years earlier. The document did not speculate about intent. It presented the sequence, the structure, and the amounts, and left the conclusions to anyone who could read a spreadsheet. Preston attempted the exit that men attempt when they have decided speed is more useful than dignity. The quick gathering of items, the turned shoulder, the stride toward the door that is too purposeful to be casual. And he was intercepted by the building's general counsel, who had been called by Lena 40 minutes earlier and had been waiting in the corridor with the specific patience of someone who has a piece of paper that justifies the patience. Derek's response to the outcome was not what Preston had planned for. Having expected to absorb a reputational loss and negotiate settlement, Derek had not anticipated Preston's immediate pivot to full cooperation with investigators in exchange for consideration. A pivot that required giving investigators every piece of communications evidence Derek had been confident would never be disclosed. The charitable fund diversion records, the North Star correspondence, the instruction to inflate Riverside's maintenance costs, the instruction to file the manipulated insurance characterization 12 years earlier. All of it reached the Commission and the State Financial Crimes Unit before midnight, the direct result of 2 men who had built their partnership on the assumption that the other would hold firm. The board voted unanimously to void the North Star transaction, suspend Preston pending investigation, and restore Celeste's full operational authority. The Boxing Commission's review of Evans' historical file was initiated within the week. The supplementary investigation records Gideon had preserved were submitted formally, and within 30 days the Commission issued a written determination that the file contained no evidence of fighter involvement in the wagering irregularity, and that the case was permanently closed. Celeste restructured the Riverside commitment through an independent community trust rather than a direct grant, which meant no future executive could redirect the funds or use the property as a corporate asset, and she offered Evan a senior program development role at Harrington Dominion. He declined the title, the office, and the salary, and counter-offered he would design and run the Recovery Through Athletics curriculum at Riverside without corporate branding or promotional obligation, for a stipend that covered his costs and nothing more. When she asked what he actually wanted from the next part of his life, Evan said he wanted to stop needing to be invisible. 6 months after the evening at the gala, Riverside Renewal Center reopened under a new name, Second Bell Renewal Center, chosen by the staff, a name that meant exactly what it said. The renovation had been completed on schedule and under budget, which was the kind of thing that surprises people who have been reading altered financial reports for too long. The weight room was new. The rehabilitation bay had expanded into the adjacent space that had been vacant for 3 years, and the Veterans Program had added 2 evening sessions to meet demand that had existed before the money arrived and had simply been waiting for the facility to be able to hold it. Evan ran the recovery and training safety program without being the face of it. The face of it was a 47-year-old former steelworker who had come in for chronic back pain and left 8 months later leading a morning conditioning group of his own. And the face of it was a veteran who had written a detailed description of his balance recovery for a physical therapy publication that nobody expected him to write. The 3 championship belts were mounted in a case near the entrance, not as trophies but as reference. A note in the adjacent placard explained that the man who had won them had also chosen to leave them, and that both decisions had required courage, and that the center existed to support both kinds. Preston Blackwell was indicted on 11 counts of financial fraud and securities manipulations, spanning both the current scheme and the Meridian Holdings arrangement 12 years prior. Derek Voss lost operational control of Voss Apex when 3 of the charitable organizations whose funds he had redirected filed coordinated civil suits, and the resulting asset freeze made it impossible to maintain the brand's operations. Celeste reformed the Harrington Crown Foundation's governance structure to require independent external audit of all community grants above $500,000 and a community advisory board with veto power over land use decisions. Changes that were specific enough to be useful and uncomfortable enough to be real. Tessa appeared at the second bell opening ceremony in a yellow jacket and stayed for 2 hours, which was longer than Evan had expected and exactly as long as she felt like staying. She did not spend the ceremony looking at the belts. She spent it watching Evan talk to people, unhurried, direct, present in the specific way he had not always been when she was younger and he was carrying a weight he had not yet figured out how to set down. Malcolm stopped by the ceremony and asked Evan whether he had given any thought to a licensed exhibition or a commentary role or anything that connected his past to his present in a visible way. Evan said he did not need another fight to know who he was. Celeste came to second bell on a Wednesday afternoon without an assistant or a schedule item, and she asked Evan if he wanted coffee after the afternoon session. And the relationship they began building that evening did not start with gratitude or with the particular debt that forms when one person saves another's institutional legacy. It started with 2 people who had spent years managing everything alone deciding, without much discussion, to try the alternative. Evan turned off the gym lights that evening, walked out through the main corridor past the case with the 3 belts, and stepped outside without pausing to look at them. Celeste was on the front steps. He did not make himself smaller when they walked away together, and for the first time in a long time, no one in the room. Because there was no room and no one watching, mistook his silence for anything other than what it was, a man who had nothing left to prove. A year after the gala, Second Bell had supported hundreds of people back into work, into physical capacity, into the ordinary forward motion of a life that had stalled. Evan kept his schedule the way he had kept it since Tessa was 4, built around her, then around the work, in that order, without apology for the priority, and he did not repeat the mistake that had cost him the years he could not recover. On the center's first anniversary, a journalist asked Evan which moment in his career had mattered most. The room expected the title defenses, or the gala, or the 3-round exhibition that had ended with Preston in a corridor and Derek on a canvas. Evan said the moment that mattered most was a specific one, the moment when he could have thrown a harder punch and chose a different one. He said it was not mercy, and it was not strategy. It was the first time he had understood the difference between power and its purpose. He visited Nora's grave that afternoon, after the ceremony, as he did on the dates that called for it. He told her that Tessa had been accepted to the university program she had wanted since she was 14. He told her that Riverside had been protected and that Preston's version of her name had been corrected in every public record that carried it. He said he had spent too many of the years since she died confusing humility with self-erasure, and that he understood now she had never asked for the latter. She had asked him to return, and it had taken him a long time to understand that returning did not require a fight, and that the fight, when it came, had not been for the belt or the reputation or even the $40 million. It had been for her name, and for the version of himself she had believed in when he forgot to. Celeste waited at the cemetery gate, giving him the space the moment required, and when he came back down the path, she did not ask what he had said. She reached for his hand, and they walked out through the iron gate together. And the man who left that cemetery was not invisible, was not smaller than he needed to be, and was not mistaking silence for safety. Derek Voss had chosen the quietest man in the room because he believed quiet men never pushed back. He had not understood that the man had been silent for 12 years, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had been waiting, without knowing it, for the moment when speaking would mean something worth saying. The strongest person in that banquet hall was never the one with the microphone. He was the one who had already learned the hardest thing any room, any floor, any connaught that actually matters will eventually ask of you. The most powerful thing a man can do is know exactly when not to use his power, and then stand in the silence without flinching for as long as it takes for the right moment to arrive.